Welcome to the WIHS Journal. On today's broadcast, I'll be talking to Jodie Diprietro. She works with the Department of Youth and Families from Focus on the Family. Today's topic, we'll be talking about how to raise pro-life children. Today's topic is raising pro-life children. And so my first question would be, how do you think that you can do that? How do we raise pro-life children?
I think we start with helping them to understand the value of all human life. So helping children understand that we are all created in God's image, and that includes preborn, that includes people of all ages, elderly, those who might have disabilities or special needs, and just that everyone is valuable and everyone is someone that is created by God in His image.
What kind of nudged you to want to do a conversation like this about, raising pro-life children?
Well, because I think that at Focus on the Family, because we embrace pro-life from the perspective of the value of human life, and obviously, actually, I am the Director of Parenting and Youth at Focus. And so from that standpoint, we were always trying to provide resources for children, resources for parents that help them to instill those values. And so we get a lot of questions, actually, from people asking about this particular topic, that life is important to me, pro-life is important to me. How do I instill that value and teach that to my children?
Yeah. And my question would be, how do you have your children instill that in other children? Is that something you can think about?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, as parents, we are models for our children, and our children can be models for other children as well. So if they are embracing life in all of its forms, human life in all of its forms, and really speaking out and showing that they care about all people, then they are able to show that to their friends and model that to their friends and have that influence as well.
Can you think of some statistics that you actually had this happen and then there was a change in a child?
I don't. I can't think of any specifics. I certainly can think of anecdotal information for sure. And I can share that. We actually have a really wonderful story on the parenting website at Focus on the Family at www.focusonthefamily.com/parenting. And it's about raising pro-life kids. And it begins with the story of a young boy who's talking about thanking his family for caring about him and allowing him to come into the world. And as it turns out, he is a young man who was born with Down syndrome. And his parents and family were very pro-life. And the story goes on to talk about how their family has very intentionally championed the importance of being the value of all life, and that they have gone on to model that for other people. So I think this young man who has Down syndrome and is now, I believe, just a little bit over 17 years old, has been a model for people around him to really talk about the value of life.
Wow. What a great example, right? Love it.
Definitely. Such a beautiful example, and a beautiful example in that family as well.
What is a good example to talk to children about abortion? Can you give an example about that?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really helpful for children to understand that God has created that life, and that life in the womb, the preborn life, is valuable. And for really small children, I think one of the ways that they can begin to grasp that is that wonderful little project that almost every little child gets at some point between the ages of maybe 3 to 5 or 7, and that is to take a little Dixie cup and put a little dirt in there and a little seed, and then they get to water it and watch it grow into a beautiful flower. And that's a great analogy for a young child to understand that life begins with that tiny little seed from a male and a female, and it develops into a baby. And so I think if we can teach kids to see that, to really nurture that little plant and put time into it and see, it just started at this tiny little seed, but then it becomes this beautiful flower or this beautiful plant, that's a very good analogy for kids. You know, kids need concrete analogies for them to be able to actually see that value of life. And then, you know, to go back and say, what would have happened if we had destroyed that life from the beginning? What would have happened if we hadn't taken care of that seed? It wouldn't have grown into that beautiful flower. So for young children, that's a really great way to kind of demonstrate that value. But for kids when they're older, I think it's important for parents to know that it's good to talk about pro-life and to talk about abortion. They are hearing about these topics. They are learning about these topics. They may have friends as they get older into the teenage years who have unplanned pregnancies and are talking about abortion. So we have to be ahead of the game and talk with our kids about that previous to them being exposed to it in their circle of friends or kids at school, what have you. And the idea is to talk very openly and to explain what it is, obviously in age-appropriate terms, and just to explain that it is something that, as Christians, we don't embrace.
Great. If you're tuning in right now, I'm speaking to Jodie Diprietro from Focus on the Family on the topic of importance, raising pro-life children. So what about some great Bible examples? Can you think of that, or Bible verses?
Well, you know, the one that comes to mind certainly is, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Just really going back to recognizing that we are all a creation of God. And I love that piece about you knit me together in my mother's womb, because it makes me think of knitting, where you bring together strands of yarn. And they don't really look like much when they are just individual strands, but when you knit them together, you become this beautiful human being. And so I really like that visual. What
else can you say to our listeners to encourage their children on this topic?
Well, you know, as I said, I think there are many things that you can do and you can model and get involved in as a family with your children. And so obviously we've talked a little bit about the value of the preborn life, but we also at Focus on the Family want to really make sure that people understand we're talking about the value of all life. So, for instance, for marginalized groups, for those who are struggling with disabilities, we know that there are places in the world where they are making mandatory abortions for people if they're if they have a diagnosis of some sort of disability in the womb. Certain disabilities are considered to be not viable human beings, and it's just such a sad thing to think that there are places in the world where that is happening. So we can talk about that value, but we can also talk about things like the value of people who are ill and help them develop an interest in caring for people who are struggling, even though they may not at a certain time look valuable in the way that some in the world might define value. We know that they are loved and valued by God. And certainly another category of that would be the frail elderly, that sometimes the frail elderly are treated as if they are less valuable than others. And at Focus, we really feel the value of all human beings, and that they're, you know, valuable from the time that they are conceived to the time that they die a natural death.
Well, a great resources you're giving us. Well, before we close today, would you mind just recapping your credentials and how our listeners can find out more information?
Sure. So I am the Director of Parenting and Youth at Focus on the Family. I would love to mention that we do have a wonderful counseling staff at Focus on the Family. And so if there's anyone who wants to talk in general just about how to parent kids and help them be more pro-life, they could call our regular talk line at 1-855-771-HELP.
Once again, that was Jodie Diprietro from Focus on the Family. She works in the Youth and Family Department at Focus on the Family. For more details about today's broadcast, you can call WIHS at 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of a staff and management of a station. I'm Anissa Porticelli for News and Public Affairs.